I think it's the storytelling of what you do. Whether you are talking to a deal source, a CEO, a new LP, you're telling your story. Because at the end of the day, like we're all in the business of selling dollars. I mean, it's the world's greatest, most mobile commodity ever.
If you're treating BD like a junior dial for dollars function, you're not just behind, you're probably burning money and reputation. Today's guest is Jay Jester, a partner at Plexus Capital and winner of the ACG Legend Award. Not only was Jay an early architect of the Audax sourcing juggernaut, but he's widely recognized as one of the four faces on the Mount Rushmore of deal sourcing. In this episode, this sourcing legend is sharing why BD should be the most senior and strategic face of your firm, how Audax built its deal flow by treating bankers like true channel partners, and why trust, not data or dollars, is the ultimate edge in the AI era. If you're building or leading a sourcing function, this is required listening. Jay's playbook is the blueprint for the next era of PE/BD. Get ready for the ultimate sourcing knowledge drop from an OG of PE deal sourcing. This is Deal Sourcery.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Deal Sourcery podcast. Joining us today is Jay Jester. Jay, good to see you.
How are you? Good to be seen.
Thanks for coming on. Jay, many of our listeners will undoubtedly know who you are, but for those that don't, a little context. Jay is now a partner at Plexus Capital in North Carolina. He previously helped build Audax into what is one of the most preeminent and most active platforms in the industry. He won the ACG Legend Award in 2024 and is often referred to as being on the Mount Rushmore of private equity business development. From what I understand, you were one of the first people to do this role and in many ways helped create what the role is today. So I think there's a lot for us to cover today, but I'd love to start a bit on your backstory. I know your first job in private equity was at Florida Capital Partners, and you work closely with Glenn Oken, who I think you described as the original BD professional in PE.
I don't think there's any doubt. I think Oken is OG number one.
Great. Well, tell us about how that came about and your experience getting into BD back then.
Yeah, I mean, just going back a little bit, I was an English major from the University of North Carolina. I somehow BS'd my way into an investment banking job. I got to work for Erskine Bowles at Bowles Hollowell Connor, which as far as OGs go, like one of the non-Wall Street M&A boutiques. And I feel like in that time frame, there were a number of them that popped up in different pockets around the country as the mid-market was being born. And after 2 years as an analyst in Charlotte, went down and interviewed with Glenn and John Kirtley and Jeff Leck at Florida Capital Partners. And if I think about like a transformative relationship in my career, it was getting the chance to wingman Glenn at FCP in the early days of mid-market private equity. Virginia guy. If there's somebody that doesn't just love Glenn, I hadn't met him yet. He's one of the most sincere, humble, and networked people you'll ever meet. And it's been fun, over a really long career to think back on who's taken the time to stay connected and check in on me. And, Oken's top that list.
He's a pure legend. I feel like one of those people that just makes you feel human and heard.
Yeah.
I feel like every time you sit down with Glenn, you just feel like you're having the deepest conversation with one of your best friends.
That's well said. And when you start like riffing movies or books, you got to bring your friggin' A game and keep up, because the brother's got a lot of range, which always makes it fun to talk to Glenn.
It feels like one of our jobs in private equity, right, is to kind of speak these other languages, right? It's like, well, English might be our first language, but the second might be, rare cars or wines or movies or something. Like, are there other languages that you kind of speak, as you think about it like that? What are your languages?
I've never thought about it this way. I like that. I do think your number one skill set, actually, I can't just limit it to BD. I think it's to being a successful human, is curiosity. And to tie it back to Glenn, I think about the number of dinners that I had in some random place with some guy that I never met. And Oken's all questions. Well, tell me about that. Well, tell me about how you got into whatever, growing whatever, or this niche sport or fishing from this type of canoe. I mean, just random stuff. And there's a lot of people you'll meet in the world that I'll call them one-uppers. As soon as you tell them about the cool vacation you took, they're just looking to one-up you and telling you about how they did that better. And Oaken was just dig another layer. It's just more curiosity. And you almost have to pull out the stuff out of Oaken, but that's his secret superpower is curiosity, and something that I've been, spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to emulate that.
I love it. So last time we caught up, you were talking a little bit about how, kind of most funds do, or maybe think about sourcing in the wrong way, right? Like that the BD guy should probably feel like the most senior person to the outside world. And I actually remembered a quote you had from, I think it was the Blue Wave podcast you were on. It was to the effect that like the sourcing team needs to be deeply connected to the deal engine room, right? Mentioning that like that connection is really like a make or break thing for truly getting sourcing right. But it often feels like today, like a lot of private equity firms are just trying to maybe bolt sourcing onto the side, right? And, like, hey, maybe you don't belong in IC. Maybe you shouldn't even be setting strategy. Like, just go dial for dollars and kind of get some deals out there. Flashing back and then also thinking forward here, like, why did it make sense to have somebody focused on business development at that time when you were kind of first getting into this? And then, like, how has that evolved over time a bit?
So if you go way back to the very early days of mid-market private equity, there weren't a lot of funds and there wasn't a lot of capital. Just finding a way to connect with an interesting mid-market business, was maybe skill set number one, or just calling the small number of intermediaries that existed back then and saying, hey, put us on a buyer's list, in a world where most of the people on the buyer's list would have been strategic buyers. And it was more of an order taker, sales-oriented kind of role. I think that old MO of, get me a human walking billboard, to go around to the thousands of deal sources and make sure I get on the buyer's list. Like, that's just a very outdated modality. And I believe that today, to your point about seniority, we live in a world where there might be 5,000 private equity firms. I mean, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of intermediaries. And you have to have someone who can speak for the firm, who understands the capabilities of the firm, how busy the firm is, and can go out and build, is the first person to begin building trust with these important channel partners who are the deal sources, the advisors, in some cases, the competing private equity firms, and certainly with the management teams and owners of these companies. And if you are still thinking, okay, the partners are going to find all the deals, we know what we like, we know all the most important intermediaries in our vertical, let's hire a BD person to run around and be in charge of everything that we don't already care about. I think that's maybe the biggest waste of time, to take an incredibly valuable forward-facing representative of the firm and send them anywhere other than your highest probability target universe is just a colossal waste of money.
Talking about the numbers of firms, we track how many firms have dedicated BD professionals. If you look at 5,000, 6,000 private equity firms, only about 450 or so have a single dedicated BD professional. Does that surprise you? And why do you think more don't?
So I would say that if that is someone who is only a part of the BD team, sort of not integrated into the rest of the platform, maybe that makes sense. And I think what happens is everyone is in BD today. If you're a multi-site healthcare investor, you're spending a lot of your time in BD. You are talking to the investment bankers, you are going to JP Morgan Healthcare, you're doing a whole bunch of things. And then every time you go to a management meeting, that is the BD function, trying to form that connection with the management team. So I might feel like that's on the low side. There is a smaller percentage for sure of people that would carry that head of BD card. And I think that, in terms of what's successful, particularly to build a durable private equity brand at scale, you need that role. Ideally, that's a partner level position who's out representing the firm.
And you believe that should generally be specialized today? Because I know you've been a proponent of kind of, I think, specialization across private equity firms, right? Like, is that, because I know historically, right, we think about it, most private equity firms, like you had You had your deal guys, I think you called them deal engineers at one point. I thought that was a cool term, like the folks that are just focused on execution around a deal, right? But like historically it was, you kind of covered everything, right? You did the sourcing, you did the execution work, you did the portfolio operations, you did exit planning, you did everything, right? Is that specialization the right thing? I mean, do you see it going more and more that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the move to mastery is a trend across everything. It's hard to find an industry where, you've got top to bottom generalists that are the key players in that industry. And I think, in a world of AI where domain mastery gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, to have somebody who really specializes just, as the business gets more and more competitive every year. So you see the specialization in operations, you see it in investor relations, you see it in sourcing or BD. You see more and more people that are co-CEOs or CEOs of the private equity platform and spend no time on transaction work. I'm seeing add-on acquisition specialists, exit specialists, supply chain specialists. I think that is a normal thing. And I actually think that you could debate whether it was IR or BD. And we talked about this earlier. I feel like there's I think we're about to begin the fifth modern private equity wave. And I think as you go through those waves, everybody was a generalist in wave one. In wave two, it was either the BD or IR were probably the first specialists, and the portfolio operations was not far behind.
And so what's the fifth wave to you?
I don't know if it's started yet. I think we hit an all-time high watermark in Q3 of 21 in terms of M&A activity, multiples so far. And again, I'm mostly talking upmarket, sort of the core middle market. I participate in what I fondly call the dinky deal market, kind of 2 to 12 of EBITDA. Really, single-digit EBITDA is kind of where I live. We're a little bit insulated from the waves. But, as I talk to my brethren at the multi-billion-dollar funds, I think we've been in a bit of a deal winter again since Q3 of 21. And I'm really curious to see how we relaunch. Is it the AI wave? Is it the blockchain wave? I still believe there could be a metaverse component to wave 5, but I don't know. I mean, that's from listening to podcasts and trying to imagine what's around the corner. But I do feel like we will begin a new wave of M&A activity, and the drivers will be quite possibly stuff we haven't imagined or haven't thought of or don't anticipate.
As we look at, your experience in kind of being part of building the sourcing machine, right? And like what a great sourcing machine looks like. Can you kind of take us under the hood, given all that context? Like what are the key components of a top tier, business development function today and looking forward?
I think the first thing you have to start with is, I don't have a better word for it. I call it organizational attunement. And by that, I mean, you have to get buy-in from all of the group heads, the industry sector leaders, that we as a team, as a private equity firm and a team, are going to face the market a certain way. And I think that means you need to figure out what your buy box is. You need to figure out what your ideal target looks like. And you need to figure out what your brand is going to be. And I think in a very, very crowded, unbelievably competitive business, it's a relatively low barrier to entry business. If you just start out thinking, we're a team of athletes, we don't know what sport we're going to play, but we're really good athletes, let's go win something. Like, I think that's a really hard way to compete. And it shocks me how many people actually do that. And I think to sit down and it's hard, grindy work of like, do the multi-day offsite and the team building to figure out all of those things that I talked about. How are we going to face the market? And your BD team has to be a part of that. That's what I mean by the, organizational attunement is number one. And then, number two is knowing where you're going to find those deals and where you're facing. And I think a lot of people start out and say, okay, we know how to do XYZ deals. And then they say to a BD person that they may not have even hired yet, okay, go find all the deals. And they're just running around trying to boil the ocean without that guidance and attunement. And that's really hard. And so I think that starting with that focus, and I would also say, don't start out trying to find 1,000 deals. Start out trying to find a dozen that are going to turn into the first platform company. And again, I think BD has to be a critical part of that, because that's also going to be the story that you're going to tell current and future LPs, whether you're raising fund one or raising fund two. Being able to have that cohesive story in a very crowded market, all begins with that organizational attunement. And once you've done that stuff, those are the big rocks in the jar, if you will. The next step is where you start getting into the systems, the support infrastructure, how you're going to use technology and how you're going to carve up the roles and responsibilities of who's doing what.
When you said it's a low barrier to entry industry, were you talking about private equity as a whole?
Yeah. In terms of doing deals, like you just think about the technologies of, at one point in time, it was SPACs, the independent sponsor model, the searcher model. There's so many different ways. And I think what's happened over the last couple of M&A ways is the democratization of private capital. Early on, they were a very small number of people, mostly on Wall Street, who had the technology or the relationships to go out and amass a big pool of equity capital that they could then deploy. And I haven't looked at the curve lately, but to go from those dozen firms in the 70s to the 5,000 firms that exist today, and that doesn't even begin to count independent sponsors, searchers, club funds, pledge funds, all the different ways that people are finding to do. It's a higher barrier to entry to go buy $1 billion business, but to buy a $120 million business, it's pretty low barrier to entry business.
It's interesting, which kind of leads credence to the point you're talking about having this organizational attunement. And it sounded like part of that attunement was really around kind of the strategy and the sorts of businesses that we want to go after. But it seemed like a big part of what you're talking about there was actually around the branding and the messaging as well. Is that right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think in a competitive market, I think it's the storytelling of what you do. And whether you are talking to a deal source, a CEO, a new LP, you're telling your story. Because at the end of the day, like we're all in the business of selling dollars. I mean, it's the world's greatest, most mobile commodity ever. And if I'm trying to argue that we should pick my dollars over Matt's dollars, and I'm just trying to argue my dollars are greener, good luck. And so what we're all selling is the story of, how do we find deals? How do we develop a thesis? What's the type of deal that we do? And I think that's the same, that storytelling, brand building. And I'm trying to remember the quote exactly, but it's, the brand is the representation of a company's or a product's relationship with an individual customer is the embodiment of the brand. And I think that's as true in private capital as it is anywhere.
Remind me, I think you had this like 3A's framework.
You got a good memory. No, it's a great guy. He's a doctor that we used to take our kids camping together. And he was sharing one time, we were sitting around the campfire and he's like, we took thousands of hours of medical training and there was one business class in medical school that he took. And he said the one thing he remembered were the 3A's, and it was ability, availability, and affability were the three things as a doctor. And, the ability is like get the medical degree. The availability, though, is like, do you have a slot? Are you in a location where patients can actually get to you? And then the affability is the bedside manner. And in a world where, especially and this was in Boston at the time, mostly every doctor you encounter has the first A. And if you found them, they have the second A. And so you think the way they differentiate themselves is the third A, is the bedside manner and the story and the brand and how the practice feels. And I just thought it was an interesting thing, even in something that you would think would be as data-driven and as critical as medical care, to think about how much the brand and the story impacts building a successful medical practice. And I think the same thing applies in private capital. Like, again, the dollars are green. You found me, so, I've got the second A, or I've been able to fly to see you. And then that affability match goes back to BD, the lead BD person who is the curator and the moderator and the protector of that story is, I think even more important than people give it credit for.
There it is. So it sounds like what we need to focus on as an industry, if you really want to have a truly standout private equity firm that's executing well at sourcing, it's getting that organizational attunement and being able to build toward that affability piece, right? Where you've got the right story and the right humans, with the right durable competitive advantages, I think is a term that you've used before, right? Like is that kind of the real differentiator today? Is that's how you really win in sourcing?
I think so. I think it's so interesting. There's so much chatter around AI And, how's it going to change everything? And, call me Pollyanna, but I think it makes trust and what we call it, likability, affability, infinitely more valuable. I mean, there was a day not long ago where I would hear people say like, that guy's a total jackass, but boy, he knows the industry. He's really good. And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with him because he's the expert. And now anybody with grok, like the cost of the input cost of expertise has gone way down in orders of magnitude today. When everybody's an expert, it puts a premium on the trust and the partners, the soft stuff and maybe I'll figure out how to do that one day, but I'm not sure I'll live to see it.
I mean, it's one of the things I feel like I talk to people about regularly. It's like you forget that at its core, people want to be in business with and want to do deals with people they like. I mean, I'm not just trying to boil it down to likability, right? Sort of thing. But like to your point, like it's a kind of that trust factor, that human to human factor, right? Like as much as we all have logical decisions we're trying to make, like, we're oftentimes still probably making them, even at a big multi-million-dollar deal sort of scenario. We're probably doing it a little bit and like make a decision based upon emotions and backfill it with logic.
I think it is more than just likability. I think it's trust.
Okay.
And the two are very closely linked. In fact, I would think that normal humans probably substitute those for one another, not in a lazy way, but in a generalist way. And I think that what's happening is there's so many different interactions. And if you are constantly having to recalculate, so you're the CEO, I'm the private equity partner, and pretend like you had no memory of our previous interactions. So every single time we had a conversation about the budget, about the options, about your bonus, you had to start from scratch and wonder about all the calculations that I'm making in this cross the table negotiation. You'd go insane, right? That to restart, negotiations are exhausting. And I think that what trust is your history with my character. And if you trust that, you've reduced your cognitive load by orders of magnitude. And there'll be some times when you're exhausted at the end of the day or the bonus negotiations. And if in the back of your head, you're thinking like, this guy might be getting ready to like screw me out of everything that I've worked for, that's a really hard way to live. And if at the end of the day, instead you go, this is still nuanced, I'm not totally sure, but I trust Jay. I've never seen him go back on his word or come at me in that way, that is reducing your cognitive load and lets our partnership interact faster, lets us make better decisions and not litigate the minutia of every single interaction. And I think that's what people are saying when they say, I want to do business with people that I like. I think that's what they're actually saying.
Is more that like, I know that Jay has the ability to do what he says he's going to do, and he does what he says he's going to do. And I trust him to do the right thing in the right situation.
I think I trust him to try to do the right thing. And I think if you like somebody, you will know that nobody's going to be perfect on that also. And it's like, yeah, we made a bad decision together, but I was trying and he was trying. And I think to me, I don't know. I'm sure that I'll ask Grok. Maybe he'll tell me there's a better definition of trust, but that's where my head goes is our history and the body of work helps us reduce the cognitive load and make better decisions together.
Maybe you could say more about this as it applies to the intermediary channel. I've heard you say you need to treat your channel partners like channel partners and understand their perspective and kind of play the long game. Can you just talk about that for a second? Like how you think the right approach to interactions with the intermediary community should go?
I think that mindset of treating deal sources like channel partners is one of the things we did at Audax earlier and better than it's ever been done. And I think it continues to this day. So if you go from private equity wave one, when it was big deals, a handful of firms, I remember hearing all the time, like, investment bankers are just the guys that get between me and the CEO and make the price go up and make everything complicated. And I think as the market has gotten bigger and more efficient, and what we identified was, no, these investment banks are really, really important members of the ecosystem. They are the guides for the journey for the companies, helping the companies get a fair price, but also helping them understand how a transaction works. And a M&A transaction is an unbelievably complex thing. I went back and looked at the data across 65 exits. The median time from when you begin the pitch process to when the deal actually closes was like 10 to 12 months. The idea that you're going to decide to sell a deal January 1st and you're going to be done at the end of March never happens. A well-run mid-market auction is a year-long journey, sometimes more. And to have a trusted guide for the journey, and I'll go back to the trust conversation that we're having, the lead BD's role of building that history and remembering that history and establishing the trust with the key channel partners, I think is what helped us build Audax into the juggernaut that it is today. And I think being long-term fair. And I think that being in the ecosystem together creates more trust, because if I'm just transactional around that one transaction and I'm always playing short-term win-win, the banker will remember that. And the next time when I'm trying to buy a different business, he will advise his client, like, no, you can't trust those guys because they are always in it for themselves. They have sharp elbows, watch your back. Or, no, I've been through the wars with these guys. And I've seen them in really difficult situations when the company missed numbers, or there was an issue at the company, or there was a huge extraneous event, and they were good partners and they did the right thing. And that accountability of having somebody in your ecosystem that you treat like a partner. And then I think by treating important investment banks like partners, I am modeling how I'm going to treat my management teams or the seller, because we're all in that same ecosystem.
Can you say more about how you're able to do that at scale? Like you mentioned at Audax, you think you did that, maybe earlier on, or, better than anyone else. Like, is there a strategy in your mind, aside from how you treat people, for how you execute on that?
I think the most important thing is, and another critical part of good BD's role is being the historian of the firm. And if you think about it, if you imagine a firm with, 7 deal partners, and 6 of them have interacted with XYZ Investment Bank, and XYZ Investment Bank said, you're a great firm, and broke a tie their way and was very collaborative. But then the 7th partner comes along and he doesn't have that history, and thereby doesn't reward all that previous work in terms of how he treats the investment bank, you're losing a ton on that. And I think that a big part of the BD job is to be the historian and to go collect that data and to be around the office and say, have these guys been good partners? Yeah, they introduced us to all these CEOs. We didn't hire any of them, but boy, great looks. Or they got us really close on these deals, and the stuff that they're sending us is a really good match for our platform. To remember that and let the counterparty know that you remember that is, I think that's a critical part of doing that at scale. When it's only 2 people, 2 partners who eat lunch together every day and have investment committee or staffed on every deal, you're sharing one brain.
Right.
But as you build scale and you have different industry groups and you have different strategies and you have a mezz strategy and an equity strategy and a small deal strategy, it becomes even more important to have organized BD playing that historian role so that you can capitalize on all of that context.
It makes sense. Yeah. And I think you talked about like how you advocate for firms propping up the BD professional as they're the kind of external face of the firm. So, make them look as senior and influential as you can, because that just enhances, what they do in the market, right? Or their perception. So I think the takeaway there is that there should be some level of seniority for hires into this role, so a lead BD professional. Do you have a take on firms that approach it from the other end? Like, there are a lot of firms that maybe because of resources, first-time fund, smaller funds, they kind of go the more junior route and have them either do proprietary sourcing or have them attend conferences. Frankly, a tall task for someone who's early in their career. I'm curious if you have a thought on just like that approach, maybe compared to how you've outlined how you would do it.
The analogy I like is my daughter was a coxswain in high school. And when I think about her versus the rowers, the engine room, who in this example, I will use like the deal engineers as the engine room, doing a ton of really, really hard, strenuous work to make the private equity fund work. And the coxswain's in the front of the boat, back to back with the rowers, steering. And that's one of the reasons she's in the front of the boat, out of the wind, kind of tucked in low. And to me, to say the BD person's junior and we're going to put the BD person in the back of the boat. I feel like that's taking away from their capability, and their purpose is to be out there representing the firm, avoiding the wrecks, and in some cases cleaning up the messes. And I'm not saying you have to go get a partner every time, but you have to have the buy-in from the partnership for whoever you put in that role. And I realize there are different models, and there are great firms out there that have built a model of a call center approach.
Yeah.
But even the person that is leading that call center needs to have the support, and again, I go back to my comment about the organizational attunement of this is important. And maybe the most important thing of, how we compete in a very crowded market. And so to have that seniority from the partnership to say, yes, we've got the right person steering and telling the story and representing us to the market. That's what I mean by the seniority comment on the BD. And I see junior BD people getting acquired all the time. Although it is interesting with a lot of the first-time funds that I've seen in the recent vintage, I feel like I'm seeing 2 senior partners and 1 very senior BD person. A lot of times are the founding team. And funny, going back to the Glenn Oken comment, I think about John Kirtley, Jeff Leck, and Glenn Oken, 2 very experienced deal partners. I was too young to know how important that was in, what year was this? In 1992. But I know it was powerful to me, and it changed my life to be reporting to one of the senior founding partners of Florida Capital Partners. Again, I was the 4th guy, but but that mattered.
So, as we look forward here, it's like we see, I feel like news articles every day, people talking about how AI is going to wipe out most white collar jobs, right? And I think I even saw Robert Smith made a quote this last week. His quote was basically, for everybody in this room, all private equity professionals, right? He's like, 40% of you are going to be using AI and you're going to figure out how to do it, and you're going to be, deploying more capital. And then for the other 60%, you're going to be looking for a new job, right? Like I don't know, when you, and it's an aggressive take, right? And I think there's some aggressive takes out there, but like when you look at the future of our industry, right? And you look at private equity, you look at deal sourcing in particular, like where do you see the roles of humans and AI in the future of our profession?
I'll go back on the superlative declarations. And I was thinking back on this, like, I remember sitting in on a panel, it was probably 2004. And the guy on the panel says, if you don't have an operation in China today to handle production of your product, you're dead. You don't even deserve to be in the private equity business. So I'm a little jaded on the declarations. And I wish I could go back and find somewhere like and it wasn't even Excel in round 1 of private equity. There's a famous story of, I can't remember who it was, like Ted Forsman or Henry Kravis walking by a Radio Shack and seeing a Tandy computer with a spreadsheet program and correctly identifying this will change our industry. And I don't know how many analysts there were creating slides by hand and taking photographs of them. That was the thing. And the industry's exploded. The headcount has exploded. And, I think it's a little bit early to declare that 60% of the people in this awesome, anti-fragile, world-changing industry are going to go away because of AI. Like I'm sure there were a bunch of bellmen in New York City that their job was to haul steamer trunks up 10 flights of stairs. And when the elevator industry or the elevator technology came along, they were wringing their hands. And pretty quickly, they had cooler jobs. I think it's interesting to look at the economy and say, when you see that the cost of the input change dramatically, it doesn't mean the end of the world. It just means there's going to be a lot of change. And I think the input that the cost has changed dramatically for is expertise. And that's what AI has provided. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see what we can do with this cheaper expertise. And I think it's going to be a good thing. And it's easy for me. I'm old, so I don't have to predict that far out. I'm excited for the rest of my working life, and I'm super excited for my kids. I think it's going to be an interesting world. And I'm going to try to stay healthy and see as much of it as I can.
I think it helps you sleep at night if you just think of it as another tool that people will use in work and enable many more new jobs that are just hard to maybe predict exactly what they'll be today.
Yeah.
All right, Jay. So we asked the audience for some questions in advance to you coming on here. One of the ones that I wanted to ask you was just about banker reciprocity And folks that are in BD seats, how do they navigate who to choose to sell a portfolio company? How to ensure that you're maybe not playing favorites and you're making sure that you're seeing the deals that you need to see? How would you approach that?
Yeah, well, I think the first part of that comes back, just thinking about the ecosystem. And I think if you think of the banks as a long-term channel partner, that sort of changes the lens. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of saying, we're just going to decide based on the pitch. And I think that's so short-sighted. People can have a good day, people can have a bad day, depending on where you are in the pitch order. And I think to factor in, is this bank going to be an effective long-term partner for us? That needs to be on the scorecard. How busy is that bank? Is the deal a fit for the sweet spot of that bank? All those different factors. Does the bank's team connect with the management team? Like all of that has to come into play, as well as the reciprocity part. It will matter if, you invite a bank to pitch 10 times and they either feel like they don't have a shot or they lose every one of those pitches. That's hard to get them back the next time. And so I think, factoring in the whole body of work and not relying just entirely upon the pitch, or even worse, just entirely upon the valuation range, is one of my favorite parts of the process, because it is such a wicked and complicated problem in that you're going to pick one bank, right, maybe one advisor and one co-advisor, but you'll never really get to know what would have happened if you'd picked the different bank. And so getting that decision right and establishing that partnership, I think, is one of the most challenging roles of the investing process, and particularly of the BD side of the process. But for me, it is, and I'll go back and use that attunement word again. I love to find the scenario where this is a transformative deal for that bank or that banker. And one of my favorite indices is to say, as the VP, as the wingman on this deal, if we get a fantastic outcome, could he become a partner because of a great outcome on my deal? That to me is the perfect attunement, or the perfect alignment, where he cares so much. Sometimes you'll find a guy who's done 20 deals in a certain space, and his whole pitch is, I'm the best, I've done the most. And I'm not sure if he's going to work the hardest up against the guy who's like, if I get this right, it will change the course of my trajectory of my career and potentially my life if I get it right. Like, that's awesome alignment. And so trying to find, that team that not only has the expertise, but also is at that inflection point in their career where it also really makes a difference. And again, it's just creating that alignment of incentives. But those are some of the factors that I think about in picking the right bank and driving the right kind of process.
It's an interesting angle and perspective to think about it. Like, how does this deal impact the whole team on the other side? And, what does that mean for the future? Do they become another really important contact for us because of this deal? But I imagine that you probably took all of those factors into consideration across your career. And I'm sure there were, a lot of 1A, 1B, very close calls. How do you navigate those conversations and just letting, 1B or 1C know that you're going in a different direction?
Well, the first thing is actually letting them know.
Yeah.
It is stunning to me the number of times I will hear from investment banks that, they went in and pitched, and then it's crickets. And then the next time they have a conversation about that deal or that pitch is when they realize that there's a teaser in the market.
Yeah.
And the thought that someone wouldn't have the courtesy to even reach out with the feedback and say, hey, here's what you did great, here's how you lost, to provide that constructive feedback. And I go back to just the knowledge of the other players in the ecosystem. These are my rough numbers, but I think, your average industry investment banker has about 60 companies in their coverage universe. And the idea is that, 12 of those will transact in a given year. And they're hoping to get pitches on, 6 to 10 of those that are trading. And then win, 3 to 5 assignments in a given calendar year. And when you think about it that way, and it's very different, like the private equity side, we'll visit hundreds of companies in a year. The amount of effort that goes into that team pitching that, and you realize that realistically, a good mid-market investment banker is doing, 10 to 12 pitches a year. And that's a huge, it's 4 to maybe as many as 8 weeks of work
Right.
go into that pitch, and to not even have the courtesy to take diligent notes and to share the feedback on why they lost so that they can get better and understand that. It very few people do that. And they're hard. They're always hard conversations. They're people that you like, people that you respect, that have spent a ton of time. And in this case, and if they lose, they basically did it for free. And the very least you can do for them is to take the time to give them that feedback about what happened so that they can get better.
Yeah. It seems like for folks that are in this role, an obvious, maybe even, simple way to differentiate yourself. If other people aren't doing that, if you just take the time and effort to be considerate of the other side of the table, then that can maybe help you stand out in a crowd.
Just walking a few miles in the other guy's shoes.
Yeah.
And it starts with the data. You got to understand how their side of the ecosystem works, and not just retreat into your own world of like, hey, I got let down on Tuesday too.
Right.
Like that's just not a way to roll.
Another question that came in was about networking events. I know that you've been a big part of ACG and you've had a lot of impact there. Someone asked us, those, I guess, used to be a really productive way to maintain and build relationships with intermediaries to drive deal flow. But it seems like, and I've heard this from other folks, that many more private equity professionals, business development professionals are on the attendee list, and it makes it a little bit harder to connect directly with bankers. How should a BD professional navigate the events to make sure that it's still productive and valuable for them?
A couple of years ago, I was supposed to go to a big M&A networking event, and last minute I had to cancel. A deal came up or something. And I bet I got 200 emails that all opened up with, man, it was great seeing you in Orlando. Let's follow up. And it made me realize that, to your point, where the events become just a giant mosh pit of thousands of people, that's a really hard place to differentiate yourself. And so I think your friend is right. There is some diminishing utility when it just becomes, a massive trade show. And I've kind of come around. In the early days of my career, I remember coming back with a stack of business cards and new contacts. And in the world of LinkedIn and everybody's CRM system, the contact information is less valuable. And I've gotten to where I like to go to smaller events. And my objective is not to come back with 100 or 200 new contacts, but it's to come back with 3 to 4 new friends. And I love the events where there is that opportunity to actually connect with people and, spend a bigger chunk of time with somebody who could be a needle mover in terms of a relationship. And I think that's also a luxury of being pretty far along in my career. For a younger person, I do think in particular, what do they call it now? Deal Max, the event in Las Vegas, the entire middle market will gather for whatever it is, 3 days, and the frictional cost of moving from one meeting to the next. But you really have to be diligent about your calendar and utilizing that time. And that's sure as hell not a place to go to the golf outing. Like,
right.
There's no way that whatever for the 6-hour slow scramble golf tournament where you're stuck with 3 people is a good use of the time there. You got to be very efficient in setting up the meetings and scheduling the meetings where you can, do like I've got a colleague that probably did 70 meetings, in the course of the Deal Max.
Yeah, those numbers always amaze me, how much people jam into those few days.
Yeah. But I would also say the chance to go to those events in person, super efficient. And I've seen people also get involved in the organization of the events, and to add back to the community woodpile, as an old friend of mine used to say, is a great way to get connected and build some deeper lifelong relationships on those boards.
It's a good segue to my next question. Just your advice to folks that are in the role, but early in their career and kind of thinking about what's ahead. One specific question that came up is, if you were earlier in your career, junior to mid-level BD professional at a PE firm, how would you evaluate roles that are proprietary focused, maybe volume focused, versus those that are more intermediary coverage? I think there's loosely like this thought that the evolution of a BD professional, someone may start in a junior role doing some proprietary outreach. Maybe it's for add-on acquisitions. And then over time, they get more of a share of the banker coverage. But there are firms that look to hire folks exclusively for proprietary sourcing, and they have a strategy behind that. You have any thoughts for folks that are kind of at that point in their career and how they should think about the skill set that they want to develop to continue to build their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever the role is, whether it's a BD role at a portfolio company, or, as you said, like going after a particular industry initiative or an industry thesis, those are great jobs. And whether, it's go out and figure out everybody in the fire and life safety industry, go to those trade shows, build those relationships, the skills apply. And, I do think it's a little bit of a different equation for the true, mid-market banker coverage. That is a more nuanced dance, if you will, versus looking for the add-ons for one consolidation strategy and one trade show, but both super valuable skill sets. And I think all the learnings would apply of, sort of stepping back, really understanding like where that industry gathers, what's the lingo of that industry, the key metrics. I think it's fascinating to go to a trade show and figure out who the mavens and the connectors are that are behind the scenes. I was talking to somebody that said one of their favorite things to do was to get the agendas for the last 3 or 4 years of that, whatever conference that industry is, and see who the speakers are. And you will see people that are invited back over and over to give the state of the market or, what's going on, and try to figure out how to connect with those folks that are, on the keynote panels over and over again, or even, who are the lenders, or who are some of the service providers and consultants who it would appear that everybody wants to hear, that are the larger panels or larger keynotes. That's a great place to start.
Yeah, I agree that they're both useful skill sets and good jobs. I think, like you've said a number of times today, it really matters the firm, who the firm is, who the people are, right? That's the context of which firm you're joining, which role you're taking is really important, and you can build a career in any of those lanes and valuable skill sets to develop. I totally agree there. So Jay, really appreciate your making the time. It was a great conversation, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. If you can, take a minute to follow us on YouTube, like, subscribe, and share, and we appreciate the time.